Hello dear viewers. In this video we summarize the idea of Italian Flavio Lombardini, who concludes that systemic racism and white privilege in current Western societies are a myth, because differences in average socio-economic outcomes between various racial population groups are not caused by racism, not by white privilege, but are the logically to be expected results of differences in average intelligence between human races. We find his views interesting, because they are based on facts and figures established by scientific studies, and because he provides an alternative for the current course of ever more identity politics, which according to him, can only lead to tyranny, polarization, and stirring up racial hatred between ethnic groups in society. This may endanger the successful liberal and democratic fabric of Western societies. If Flavio Lombardini is right, his ideas could explain a lot of things that until now are unproven and incomprehensible. Flavio Lombardini has written an article in which he denies the existence of systemic racism and white privilege, two concepts that apparently would explain why Hispanics, Muslims, and Afro-Americans on average perform not so good as whites, for instance where it concerns income, education, high-paid jobs, unemployment, welfare dependency, and criminality. Although racism undoubtedly is still present in Western societies, anti-discrimination laws have been issued preventing discrimination where this really matters for people's life opportunities, like education, housing, employment, and other areas of social life, such as public accommodations. In those decisive areas, discrimination on the basis of race is totally banned. Yet, the gap in socio-economic outcomes between whites and minorities remained. Because of that, policies of affirmative actions were introduced to favor blacks and other minorities over whites, for instance in job applications, job promotions, access to colleges and universities, and the allocation of social housing. In addition, trillions of dollars have been invested to support black, Hispanic, and Muslim neighborhoods. The aim was to eliminate the worse starting position of minorities compared to whites. In general, blacks, Hispanics, and Muslims live in less advantageous social conditions than whites. These differences had to be taken away, which required a more favorable treatment of minorities and massive extra investments. Despite of all these efforts made during the last 50 years, the gap in socio-economic outcomes between the various racial groups remained. On average, the income and social position of whites is still better than that of other ethnic groups. On average, whites still have a higher education level than other races. On average, whites are more represented at the top of the government and the corporate and academic world. On average, whites are still less unemployed and less dependent on social welfare than other racial groups. On average, the crime rate among whites is still lower than among black and brown minorities. The abolishment of racial discrimination in practice, the wide application of affirmative action programs favoring non-whites over whites, and massive financial investments made on behalf of minorities, had the result that this gap in socio-economic outcomes no longer could be attributed to racism. In fact, Western societies had successfully removed racism and racial discrimination as a factor that gave blacks, Hispanics, and Muslims a less better starting position. Left-wing politicians, academics, and black activists then faced a huge problem. When real forms of racism are no longer present, and social conditions are leveled out by means of affirmative actions and massive investments, then how is it possible that whites still do better on average than blacks, Hispanics, and Muslims? On average, the socio-economic outcomes for all racial groups should be the same. But they are not. That is the moment that left-wing politicians, academics, and black activists decided to opt for a theory that could no longer be corroborated by facts and figures. Instead, they made up their own explanation and sold it to the public as the new truth. When real forms of racism are no longer visible and social conditions are leveled out, but socio-economic outcomes still differ between various racial groups, there must be something in society to explain this, and this something is unconscious and invisible racism and white privilege. They simply redefined the meaning of racism. Originally, racism meant the belief that various racial groups on average possess by nature different mental and physical capacities so that they can be divided in more and less superior human races, with the result that it is justified to treat people differently on account of nothing else than their skin color. But such forms of racism no longer existed, that is to say, at least they could not explain the still present gap between socio-economic outcomes. Left-wing politicians, academics, and black activists came up with a simple solution. They still used the strong word racism, embedded in anti-discrimination laws and well known in liberal societies as something with a very negative connotation, but gave it another meaning. Racism no longer relates to having a negative opinion and attitude in relation to people of another race that finds its source in alleged genetic differences, but refers to the implicit and institutional structures that through bias and prejudices channels the flow of power, opportunities, and resources towards some races and away from others. Racism no longer relates to visible differences in treatment based on race, but to invisible prejudices apparently only present among white people. It is an entirely new concept, lacking any connection with the original term racism, focusing on the collective result instead of on the ideas and acts of the individual in practice. It makes a distinction, and this solely on the basis of race and power, between the racial group having the most power and the racial groups having less. Belonging to the racial group with the most power, thus whites, automatically makes you racist. Belonging to the racial group with less power, like Hispanics, Muslims, and blacks, automatically makes you a victim of racism. In other words, someone's race identifies a person either as a racist profiting from white privilege or as a victim of systemic racism who is damaged for that reason. A person's individual possibilities, opportunities, capacities, and achievements no longer play a role. This is in fact a very racist standpoint, violating the liberal principles of individual sovereignty and equality. An individual white person may be treated less only because his skin color allocates him to the white group, regardless of his individual possibilities, opportunities, capacities, and achievements. On the other hand, a black or brown person will be treated better by the government and under the law, also irrespective of his individual possibilities, opportunities, capacities, and achievements. The skin color of the people involved is the only reason to treat them differently. This indeed is very racist and a violation of the individual sovereignty and equality of people who are officially treated less. They have nothing to do with the better position of whites in general, nor do they benefit from that personally. But with help of mainstream media, left-wing politicians, academics, and black activists were nonetheless able to sell it as the new truth and even to display it as a form of social justice. The concepts of systemic racism and white privilege were promoted as a result. Systemic racism is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization, which can lead to discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. Not on account of detectable forms of discrimination or racism, which are forbidden and not perceivable in the real world, but because the white people running society and leading its organizations, although officially adhering and even applying non-discriminatory rules, unconsciously still think and act racist. When making decisions in practice, they always favor whites over others, despite of their official policies and actions doing the opposite. Often they are not even aware of it, but unconsciously they have a mindset to stick to their own kind and to see people of another race as criminals or less qualified candidates, or they simply apply a practice with which they are familiar by virtue of their white heritage, unaware that minorities act from another perspective and are disadvantaged as a result. White privilege, in fact, is nothing more than the opposite of systemic racism. It is the societal privilege that favors white people over non-white people in Western societies, particularly if they are otherwise under the same social, political or economic circumstances. Despite of these equal circumstances, whites always profit the most. And also here, some unconscious racism apparently still triggers white people in power to favor whites over non-whites based on bias and racial prejudice, yet often without being aware of it. Just being born as a white person has the result that you benefit from this unconscious form of racism silently present among the ones leading the organizations of society, and this again despite of all official policies and indeed practices regulating a more favorable position for non-whites. Systemic racism and white privilege are the reasons why whites on average perform better than blacks, Hispanics, and Muslims. Some activists promoting this new narrative even claim that the police is used by the white population group as an institution to degrade blacks, Hispanics, and Muslims with the aim to secure the privileged position of whites in Western societies. According to the critical race theory, even the entire concept of race has been invented by whites so as to be able to suppress other people who do not look like them. In truth, there are no biological races, they claim. Yet, the problem with these new theories, explaining the differences in average socio-economic outcomes between various human races in another way than before, is that they cannot be proven by facts and figures. Scientific research does not provide any basis to support them. On the contrary, scientific studies show that always other factors than racism and white privilege cause the differences in socio-economic outcomes between racial population groups. Let's look a bit closer at what they are actually claiming behind their nice-sounding slogans for social justice. Just think a minute about it. They tell us that, even though we are not dealing with visible or tangible racism, unconscious racism determines people's social position of which society is unaware, that is why it cannot be detected in practice. And they tell us furthermore that whites cannot feel how blacks are always discriminated. Racism thus has been reduced to a feeling, an emotion, regardless of facts and arguments and regardless of what is actually perceptible in the real world. A metaphysical world has been created that, as an invisible mist, supposedly hangs in and over society and intoxicates everyone. But although no one can see or grab it, it is there. That's what they tell you. Why does it exist? That's because differences in socio-economic outcomes between equal racial groups still exist. The cause thereof must be unconscious racism and white privilege, since forms of conscious and visible racism are largely absent, whereas starting opportunities are on average virtually equalized for all racial groups. When all human races possess on average the same mental and cognitive abilities, when real racism has been eliminated, when social starting opportunities have been leveled out, all human races should on average produce equal socio-economic outcomes. But this has not happened. That's why unconscious not detectable racism and white privilege were invented as answer to explain those socio-economic differences. But as said before, there is absolutely nothing to substantiate this claim. It is a religious-like belief. You either believe it or you don't. And if you don't, you will be attacked as a disbeliever, an evil heretic, thus a racist, Nazi or white supremacist. Where a dogma cannot be built on facts and figures, other instruments are required to make people believe in it anyway, like education, media propaganda and personal attacks of people who apparently do not believe in the new narrative. This is what we see today. The new narrative has become a truth of its own, disconnected from the real world and from the factors which truly produce the effects in society to which they oppose. Those factors are replaced by imaginary ones, fitting the narrative to make it at least sound in theory. But still, that theory itself does not correspond with reality. A metaphysical belief is now dominating Western societies, not dissimilar from Christianity in medieval times, communism in the former Soviet Union, or Islam in the current Middle East. As always, cultural programming is its source. As Terence McKenna already said, we are caged by our cultural programming. Culture is a mass hallucination, and when you step outside the mass hallucination you see it for what it's worth. According to Lombardini, there is only one way to escape from such mass hallucinations in which every institution and person in society desperately tries to push you, namely by reverting to facts and figures based on the universal laws of nature, which are invulnerable for man-made culture because they cannot be manipulated randomly by political or religious ideologists with their own agenda, but apply, to, and on behalf of all people independently. They are the tools to release yourself from the metaphysical grip on society of the elites and from the power of the ones creating and upholding a false narrative for which they use their own self-invented distinction between morally right and morally wrong. Why is it important to distance yourself from a dogma that is not true? Why not just follow them? That's because a dogma that is not true will always get in conflict with reality. It must create its own forms of unfairness in the real world, from which real people will suffer. Only more coercion, propaganda, and the elimination of human rights makes it possible for the false dogma to sustain anyhow. In the end, violence is the only tool to uphold the dogma still. Only the promoters of the dogma will benefit from that, but in the meantime many other people will be damaged. Ultimately, the dogma nevertheless collapses. Despite of all tyranny applied, it cannot win the battle against reality. So despite of all human suffering, it will not bring any solution for the problems it initially addressed. Therefore it is a dead-end street. Time is wasted and many people are harmed in the meantime. That is why it is always better to revert to facts and figures and to find a proper solution for the existing problems on the basis thereof, which must include a moral and political evaluation of what has been established factually. Because the first signs of tyranny are clearly visible today in Western societies, particularly in America, it is time to stop this movement and to point at the true causes of differences in socio-economic outcomes for different racial groups. Although Lombardini accepts that other inborn traits and social environment have an effect on socio-economic outcomes too, he points at the strong correlation between IQ and those socio-economic outcomes in real life. The higher the IQ, the higher the income and education level and the lower the rate of unemployment, welfare dependency, and crime. The reverse is also true. The lower the IQ, the lower the income and education level and the higher the rate of unemployment, welfare dependency, and crime. IQ and education have, jointly with the possession of capital, taken in a decisive role in current Western societies for social position and societal success. No one contradicts this conclusion. It is visible in all studies and in real life. But then Lombardini makes a connection with differences in average IQ between various human races. This is the real controversial part in his article. He states that thousands of scientific studies worldwide have concluded that IQ tests are a proper instrument to measure people's general intelligence, that is to say their general cognitive abilities, and that those studies consistently display a different level of average IQ for each racial population group. When in general IQ has such a strong relation with socio-economic outcomes, and when the average IQ of all human races is not the same, this logically must mean that the average socio-economic outcomes are not the same either for all racial groups, but that they must follow the IQ pattern. The higher the average IQ of a specific racial group, the better the average socio-economic results of that group. The lower the average IQ of a particular racial group, the lower the average socio-economic outcomes of this group. Therefore, Lombardini makes a direct link between IQ, racial IQ differences, and differences in socio-economic outcomes for various racial population groups. IQ then is the decisive cause of differences in socio-economic outcomes, not systemic racism or white privilege. This also means that the current dogma, based on the premise of equal average intelligence of all human races, which according to the dogma should have produced equal socio-economic outcomes, is not true and therefore must lead to its own forms of unfairness and eventually to tyranny. Lombardini concludes that it has been proven sufficiently that there are different biological races, that intelligence in general is 60% to 80% inborn, which percentage depends on the age of the person involved, and that intelligence and education level therefore largely find their origin in DNA sequencing. On account thereof, he concludes that IQ tests conducted worldwide have proven that a large part of the differences in average IQ scores between racial groups is inborn, so that differences in socio-economic outcomes cannot be tackled with legislation, affirmative actions, and massive financial subsidies. Continuing this route even further, will not solve the problem, but will only cause polarization, racial hatred, and the destruction of social cohesion, reciprocity and trust, the three keystones of any successful society to create the benefits of group synergy. In the end it will produce tyranny and destroy the liberal principles of individual sovereignty and equality and even democracy. Because left-wing politicians, academics and black activists have made race through their identity politics a part of the political debate, and even the decisive part of it, we must point them at their error and restore the liberal principles of individual sovereignty and equality of all human beings. Race can never be a ground to treat people differently. The new concepts of systemic racism and white privilege, although providing a very easy way out, refer to a non-existing world and therefore cannot contribute to a solution for problems in the real world. It's a huge taboo, but the premise of equal mental and cognitive abilities of all human races is false. Subsequently, Lombardini tries to clarify the correlation between IQ and socio-economic outcomes, and between racial differences in average IQ and differences in socio-economic outcomes for various racial groups. Lombardini uses the outcomes of many scientific IQ studies as presented in this ranking order. If intelligence is for a substantial part inborn, and if there appear to exist racial differences in this respect, then the pattern of scores has to be always the same. Inborn differences presume the existence of a fixed genetic differences not influenced by cultural or environmental factors. The more they differ between numerous studies, the less probable it is that inborn genetics is the cause of racial IQ differences or that such IQ tests are a proper instrument to measure it. But IQ studies do meet this criterion. Regardless of when or where the IQ test was taken, Jews always have the highest IQ, followed by East Asians, then whites, then Hispanics, and Muslims, whereas Afro-Americans and Black Africans always have the lowest score. The IQ points may differ to some extent, depending on the tests taken, but the ranking order is always the same with proportionally the same differences between the various races, regardless of whether the study was conducted in a multiracial population like that of the USA, Brazil, Canada, or in countries with a mixed population like Britain or the Netherlands. Another rule should be apparent also, that is if IQ tests are measuring the correct results. It should not matter in which country a specific racial group is tested. Chinese people living in America should, on average, produce the same results as Chinese people living in Argentina or in China itself. The same should of course apply to other groups. That's a conclusion that must follow from the premise itself. But the studies on racial IQ differences also comply with this rule and the allocated points are always almost the same. Chinese people in China score the same IQ points, namely 105, as Chinese people in the USA or Europe. White Europeans score the same IQ points, namely 100, in European countries as white Europeans in the USA or Brazil. That's a necessity in this case to make such scores scientifically valid. But when they do meet that criterion, that is also a strong indication that they are correct. And it's at the same time an indication that cultural and environmental impacts have been filtered out properly in the applied tests themselves, because otherwise the pattern and scores would have been more dissimilar depending on the country where the study was conducted. When you look at the map regarding the distribution of IQ worldwide and you roughly know the ethnic composition of the population of the countries, you cannot help but wonder. This is not in conformity at all with the fixed idea that has been taught to everyone at home and school. And it is not in conformity with the fixed idea that we all see and hear all day in Western media and politics. Also, when zooming in to investigate the details, the scientific outcomes appear to be very different from the unchallengeable identical intelligence dogma spread for moral and political reasons in the Western world. When looking for instance at Caribbean countries with a black population of Western African descent, like Jamaica and Haiti, you see the same IQ scores as in West African countries, although the local culture has developed dissimilar and people's environmental circumstances are not the same. It's unlikely also to assume that neighboring peoples, like Chinese and Koreans, or Dutch and Germans, merely by chance have almost the same IQ scores, though very different from other more faraway nations with another racial population. Distance itself is not the reason. The IQ scores of Argentina and Australia with a large white population are the same as for European countries with mainly a white population. Is it then because these countries have a similar culture? China and Japan have similar IQ scores, yet certainly not a similar culture. The same goes for Islamic Pakistan and Hindustan India. Similar IQ scores, yet very different cultures. And it seems no coincidence either that the differences between ethnic groups correspond independently from the dominant culture. The IQ scores for Jews, East Asians, Europeans, South Asians, Arabs, blacks, and so on within the American population, are for instance the same as those for these races in Brazil, Colombia, or the UK, and also correspond with the IQ scores for these racial groups in countries where they form the vast majority of the population. This again points at innate racial intelligence differences and that IQ tests have filtered out social and environmental factors properly. When IQ is the decisive factor for societal success in modern Western societies and when the average IQ of different human races is not the same, this logically must have the result that also the average socio-economic outcomes for these racial groups will not be the same. So what's the relation between these average IQ scores and average socio-economic outcomes in a multiracial country like the United States? When we do not look at different racial groups but merely at the total of the entire population, we see that the level of intelligence as measured in IQ tests corresponds with the level of income. People with a higher IQ earn in general more than people with a low IQ. It also corresponds with people's property, thus their net worth. No scientist denies this strong relationship. Not even left-wing politicians, academics, and black activists do. The coordinate systems only show the relation between IQ and income and net worth as established scientifically, without making a distinction between racial groups. But if income and net worth are determined for a large part by IQ, and if the average IQ of races is not the same, then along that line a distinction between the average income of the various racial groups should be visible accordingly. And that is indeed the case. Racial groups with higher average IQs have on average a higher income. Racial groups with lower average IQs have on average a lower income. Lombardini sees this as evidence that there is a strong relationship between IQ and socio-economic outcomes, but also for the existence of racial IQ differences. A person's IQ also affects his education level. People with a high IQ tend to attain a higher education level than people with a low IQ. The level of education determines the average income earned. This applies when looking at the general relation between education and income. In general, a higher education means a higher income. The exception for people with a doctorate on the right side of the picture relates to the fact that they often work at public institutions like universities and research centers where wages are lower than at the top of the corporate world, although their salary is still very high. If the level of education is determined by IQ and if the average IQ of races is not the same, then along that line a distinction between the average education level of the various racial groups should be visible. And, again, that is the case. Racial groups with higher average IQs have on average a higher education level. Racial groups with lower average IQs have on average a lower level of education. The higher the average IQ, the higher the average education level. IQ, education, and income also seem to have a relation with social class. People of the lower social class on average have a lower IQ and a lower education level than people of the middle class, who again have a lower IQ and education level than people of the social highest class. An IQ in the 70 to 75 range and below, what many psychologists would label borderline retarded, implies a life that is guaranteed to be short of opportunities. Very few students in that range will absorb much of what elementary school teaches, and virtually none will graduate from high school. Few will succeed in finding and keeping good jobs. None will be admitted into the armed forces, for it is required by US law to screen out people with the lowest IQ. There have been numerous studies on IQ according to occupational social class, stretching back over many decades. Typically, the average IQ of the highest occupational social class, mainly professional and senior managerial workers such as professors, doctors, and bank managers, is 115 or more. By comparison, the average IQ of the low social class of unskilled workers is about 90. In round numbers, there are differences of nearly 2 standard deviations, or 25 IQ points, between the high and low occupational social classes. This division of intelligence between the various social classes could be for more than half hereditary, in the sense that people from the higher social class, who on average have a higher intelligence, more often have children with similarly high intelligence, also because the father and mother tend to look for a suitable partner more and more in their own social class having a high IQ too. It could be hereditary just as well within the lower social class. Fathers and mothers from the lower social class are on average less intelligent. They also tend to find a partner within that same class, with the result that their children are on average less intelligent as well. The middle class fits neatly in between, although it is more common for a father or mother of this class to find a partner in the lower or higher class. IQ also shows itself as relevant factor in the lowest social class of people who are structurally dependent on social welfare and much engaged in criminality. The average IQ of homeless people is for instance around 80, that of American prisoners is 83 for whites and 75 for blacks. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge in Britain were criticized for accepting so few students from the lower social class, while students with parents from the highest social class were overly represented. Contrary to what leftist activists claimed, this was not the result of social bias of those two renowned universities, but of the fact that on average much more people from the higher social class possessed the required basic level of intelligence for admission than people from the lower social class. It appeared that, since IQ was the relevant factor, the average child from the highest social class was up to 30 times more likely to qualify for admission to a highly selective university than the average child from the lowest social class. When you know that graduates from Oxford and Cambridge on average earn an income that is more than 10 times as high as that of an unskilled worker, and that they experience less unemployment, this means that these IQ differences between people from the lower and higher social class are transposed through their education levels to income and social position. This figure shows the relationship between IQ and, among other things, unemployment, welfare dependency, and school dropouts, again without any differentiation between racial groups. In general, people with a low IQ are more unemployed than people with a high IQ. In general, people with a high IQ are far less dependent on social welfare. And in general, dropping out of high school early, happens much more in regard to people with a low IQ than people with a high IQ. It is troublesome to see how big the influence of IQ is on all these socio-economic outcomes. If IQ in general tells something about social class and if racial groups do not have the same average intelligence, then this must be visible in the number of people unemployed and dependent on social welfare within the various human races. And, again, it is. Unemployment is relatively speaking always higher among Afro-Americans than among Hispanics, who are relatively speaking more unemployed than whites and East Asians. One could argue that this is caused by systemic racism and white privilege, although both are not detectable in real society, but it is a fact that it is in conformity with the importance of IQ for unemployment as such. In all racial groups, if investigated separately, people with the lowest IQ are facing the most unemployment, while people with the highest IQ are hardly affected by it. IQ is the decisive factor, not racism or white privilege. Although in absolute numbers, there are more whites in the US receiving social welfare, 6.2 million, than blacks, 2.8 million, and than Hispanics, 2.4 million, if calculated in proportion to their part of the total population of the US, the same pattern is perceivable, thus in line with the average IQ scores of racial groups. Relatively speaking, blacks are more dependent on social welfare than Hispanics, who again are more dependent on it than whites. In all racial groups, people with a low IQ are overly represented in the total of persons receiving social welfare. IQ as such is the main cause, not race. Lombardini claims that there seems to exist a circle of factors reinforcing each other, either downward or upward, based on intelligence. The approach up until now in politics and policy making has been that people from the low social class live in worse social conditions and, as a consequence thereof, have less possibilities to attain a good education and a well-paid job, due to which they are more likely to live in poverty and to remain dependent on social welfare, which again may trigger criminality. Intelligence, however, is according to the main view not part of the relevant factors. And although Lombardini does not want to deny the importance of social environment, the right approach to his opinion should be, or at least could just as well be, that people with a low IQ miss the capacity to attain a good education, which in its turn makes that they cannot find a well-paid job and have to compete on the labor market with many similar people who could perform the same work too, including cheap labor migrants and machines, so that the chance of being unemployed is far greater. A low IQ also makes it hard for them in a complex society to deal with all sorts of problems and administrative issues they face in their daily life, for instance healthcare and housing issues, and sometimes even in regard to raising their children, all topics for which they are factually and financially dependent on the assistance of others, that is to say of the government. Poverty surely will have an influence on crime. But also IQ may have that impact. Be that as it may, the fact is that there is a strong correlation between IQ and crime. People with a low IQ commit, relatively speaking, much more crimes than people with a high IQ, particularly where it concerns violent and gun-related crimes. Whether IQ is only the cause of a low social position, that in its turn increases the chance of criminal activities, or whether it is an independent factor for criminal behavior, next to a worse social environment, the fact remains that people with a low IQ commit much more crimes than people with a high IQ. Also, this relationship between IQ and crime rates is visible in relation to racial intelligence differences. Relatively speaking, blacks are more criminal than Hispanics, who are more criminal than whites, who in their turn are more criminal than East Asians. The most convincing argument of Lombardini that racial IQ differences cause differences in socio-economic outcomes, is presented when he looks at average socio-economic outcomes for people of different race, yet with an IQ in the same range. When IQ is the decisive factor, and not racism, then East Asians, whites, Hispanics, and Afro-Americans with the same IQ level should on average produce the same socio-economic outcomes. And, again, that is the case. The most decisive factor is always IQ, not race. So when you take 1,000 black people within a certain IQ range and compare their income, education and social position with 1,000 white people in the same IQ range, there are hardly any differences. In this coordinate figure, you see on the left the average income from top to bottom, and underneath people's IQ from left to right. When looking at the three distinctive lines, blue for Hispanics, green for Afro-Americans, and beige for others, that is to say Jews, East Asians, and whites, all incomes correlate with IQ. The higher the IQ of a person, the higher his income, and this within all racial groups. Starting from an IQ point of 50, knowing that there are hardly any people functioning independently with a lower IQ than 50, it is clear that men of the others group, the beige line, with an IQ in the range of 50 to 110, earn a bit more than Hispanic and black men in the same IQ range, but that in the IQ range of 110 to 140 it is exact the other way around. If East Asians and Jews are removed from the beige line, the income differences between white, Hispanic, and black males in the IQ range of 50 to 110 get smaller, even to an extent that Hispanics on average earn a bit more than whites with the same IQ. When the same method is used in the IQ range of 110 to 140, the differences between Hispanics and blacks compared to whites increase further, in the sense that blacks with an IQ of 120 or 125 IQ earn more than Hispanics, who in their turn earn more than whites, yet not than Jews and East Asians. When the same method is applied to women's income in relation to IQ, the result is by and large the same, with the exception that Hispanic women always earn more than white women with the same IQ, whereas the income differences between black women and white women in the 110 to 140 range are even greater in favor of blacks than between black and white men. The shown graphics are just related to one study, but the general line is the same in other similar research. Lombardini is not suggesting that the aforementioned is always the exact outcome for the relationship between income and IQ, and neither that there aren't other possible factors that may have influence as well. It's indeed possible that racism and discrimination partly explain why black men with a low IQ earn relatively less than Hispanic or white men with a similar low IQ, although in that case one would expect that the gap in income would not decrease when IQ points are rising. Another explanation for the fact that black men with a low IQ earn relatively a bit less than white and Hispanic men with similar low IQs, could be that a disproportionate share of low IQ black men are involved in crime and do not earn anything while being imprisoned, which also means that they are poorly attached to the labor market. Where it concerns criminality, the outcomes of people with the same low intelligence are not the same for all racial groups. Blacks commit up to 3 times more crime than whites with the same low IQ. The lower income for black women with a low IQ could relate to discrimination and racism, but could just as well be the result of the fact that black women relatively more lack the support of a man than Hispanic and white women with similar low IQs, and that the group of black women contains more unmarried teen mothers, lessening their availability on the job market. The fact that Hispanic women earn on average more than white women in the same IQ ranges may be the result of cultural differences and the primary incentive of migrants to improve their life through work. But the overall result of all studies is that no significant differences were found between racial groups within the same IQ ranges. Blacks with the same IQ and education level on average get paid the same as whites or East Asians with the same IQ and education level. This proves that the claim of systemic racism and white privilege is false. There is no unconscious racism due to which blacks and Hispanics are disadvantaged and whites favored. It is a fantasy story not actually present in the real world, a myth, only created for political purposes. You may still believe it, of course. Fortunately, we have freedom of thought and expression. Yet, what you are not allowed to do, is denying others those same rights when they are telling the facts that contradict the myth, and you may neither spread lies instead or treat people of a certain race differently on account of your self-tinkered story. We do not accept such behavior where it concerns religions. We should neither accept it in regard to the current metaphysical dogma of systemic racism and white privilege referring to just another imaginary world as well. In conclusion, Lombardini says that there is a strong correlation between IQ on the one hand, and income, education, unemployment, welfare dependency, crime, and social position on the other. When IQ has such a tight connection with socio-economic outcomes and when IQ differences exist on average between various racial groups, this could explain that IQ rather than racism and white privilege is the decisive factor for differences in average socio-economic outcomes between racial groups. In other words, there is a direct link between IQ and socio-economic outcomes on the one hand, while there are differences in average intelligence between the various racial groups on the other. Then it is more plausible that IQ and differences in IQ are the main cause of differences in socio-economic outcomes, and that institutional racism and white privilege do not create these differences and therefore do not exist in the real world. First, because systemic racism and white privilege are not detectable in the real world. They are based on a false method of comparing average socio-economic outcomes of racial groups without being able to point at any real racism or white privilege in practice. You can only believe it, or not. A second reason to deny the existence of systemic racism and white privilege, and to accept the existence of different average intelligence between races, is that the pattern of socio-economic outcomes is always, and this within all races, coherent with IQ, which confirms the great importance of IQ at all levels. If whites have a low IQ, they belong on average to the lower social class. If they have a median IQ, they belong on average to the middle class. If they have a high IQ, they belong on average to the highest social class. But this is the same within every racial group. If systemic racism and white privilege would be real, the effects thereof should have been visible in each racial group by differences compared to this standard pattern between IQ and socio-economic outcomes. But such discrepancies are not there. The third reason to deny the existence of systemic racism and white privilege is that, if they would exist, it is incomprehensible why East Asians perform on average better than whites in a society seemingly dominated by whites. Apparently whites do not discriminate East Asians unconsciously. What is even more, they favor them at the expense of their so-called own white group. That is of course something that does not fit at all in the narrative. White privilege presumes the existence of a favorable position for whites compared to other racial groups because all relevant organizations of society are run by whites. Then how is it possible that East Asians always come out better on average than whites? Their higher average IQ and higher education level, however, could explain this result. There is no flaw in this respect. A fourth reason to deny the existence of systemic racism and white privilege is that people with the same IQ, regardless of their race, produce on average the same socio-economic outcomes where it concerns education, low-skilled jobs, high-paid jobs, employment, welfare dependency, and so forth. In other words, white people with a specific IQ have on average the same socio-economic results as brown and black people with the same IQ. It is not that white people with a low IQ still outperform brown and black people with the same low or even with a higher IQ. If that would be the case, this could be a sign of white privilege, but also of cultural variables. But that is not the case. In the real world, this difference cannot be perceived anywhere. The average socio-economic outcomes are linked to IQ, but people of all races with the same IQ have on average the same socio-economic results, and this at the bottom, in the middle and at the top. Again, this does not match with the new dogma. Whites with a particular IQ should on average have produced better socio-economic outcomes than Hispanics or Afro-Americans with the same IQ if systemic racism and white privilege would exist. But they do not, at least not beyond very small differences that can be explained by cultural variables. Therefore, according to Lombardini, systemic racism and white privilege are a myth, a self-made fantasy tale not in line with the real world. Here are two famous bell curves displaying the different distribution of IQ within the white and black population of America. The black bell-shaped curve represents the distribution of IQ scores for African Americans, and the gray bell-shaped curve shows the distribution of scores for white Americans. Although there is an overlap of IQ scores for around 50%, and although we see that both groups contain very unintelligent and very intelligent people, the average IQ score for African Americans of 85 is about 15 points lower than the average IQ score for whites of 100. Now let's assume, just for the sake of the argument, that on average the outcomes for societal success of people in the lower IQ range of 55 to 77, see the red line square in this picture, are not as beneficial as those for people in higher IQ ranges regardless of their race. You really cannot deny that people with such a low IQ in general have a lower income and have more difficulties to participate effectively in today's society. They also commit far more crimes than people with higher IQs. This applies to all people whatever their race. If you follow this line of reasoning, you will see that Afro-Americans are relatively more present in this lower IQ range than whites. So it is expectable that due to these differences in IQ, Afro-Americans will on average reside more than whites in the social lower class, have lower incomes and are more dependent on social welfare. That has nothing to do with racism or white privilege, but with a disproportional distribution of inborn intelligence among the various racial groups combined with the importance of intelligence in current Western societies. When the red line square would be shifted to the right, it would appear that, relatively speaking, more whites than blacks have a higher intelligence. This could explain why, on average, there are more white than black directors, managers, doctors, lawyers, and scientists, and why whites, on average, are able to attain a higher education level than blacks. When you would draw a vertical line from the IQ point 80 to the top, you would see that the white and black people you encounter on that line, all having the same IQ, on average produce virtually the same socio-economic outcomes. This applies also when you would draw a vertical line from the IQ point 70, 90, 100, or 130. Only where it concerns criminality this is different. Black men with a low to very low IQ commit, relatively speaking, much more crimes than whites with the same IQ. Why? According to Lombardini, we do not know yet. Although Lombardini is aware that people will attack him for being terribly racist, reason why he conceals his real identity, he does not think that accepting the existence of racial intelligence differences is racist in itself, and he does not see himself as a racist. First, because it only concerns the average intelligence of the various racial groups. Lombardini compares the average socio-economic outcomes for various racial groups to which left-wing politicians, academics, and black activists refer to corroborate systemic racism and white privilege with the average IQ of different racial groups. The word average is decisive for both. Average intelligence of a racial group says nothing about the personal socio-economic outcomes or personal intelligence of individuals who merely on account of their race belong to that group. Within each racial group you have poor, middle class and very rich people. And within each racial group you have stupid, medium bright, smart, and super intelligent individuals. When the average IQ of Afro-Americans is 85, then this does not mean that all Afro-Americans have that specific IQ. Some will have an IQ of 70, some of 85, some of 100 and others of 130. The same applies to individuals of the white, Hispanic, Jewish, and East Asian group. Therefore, one cannot determine in advance merely on account of someone's skin color or ethnicity whether he is stupid or smart. The dumbest individual of the most smart group is not smarter than the brightest person of the least smart group. There is a large overlap, whereas every group has very stupid and also very intelligent individuals. You therefore cannot base an individual's intelligence on his race, but still only on his personal capacities, actions, and achievements. Race as such does not justify any different appraisal. Secondly, a person's intelligence is according to Lombardini not the right criterion to divide people in superior or inferior. A human being is much more than his intelligence. Other factors, like empathy, solidarity, reciprocity, humor, creativity, musicality, bravery, discipline, obedience, aggressiveness, and many other aspects form part as well of the organism into which humans have evolved in the course of millions of years. Those other traits, making us human just the same, are not linked to intelligence as such. A very intelligent person is not by definition more emphatic or creative. And a dumb person is not by definition less disciplined or brave. We acknowledge that such a correlation is lacking, while it has neither been detected scientifically, at least not one-on-one. In other words, although intelligence is an economic factor relevant for reaching social and economic success in modern societies, it has no special meaning as moral criterion. Every human is a container of hundreds of mental and physical capacities and characteristics all equally important for a moral evaluation, of which intelligence is just one. Lombardini does not think, and he believes most people do not think either, that a less bright white factory worker is less worthy as a human being than a super intelligent white professor. Although economic criteria may justify why the extraordinary and rare capacities of the white professor legitimize a higher salary than the more common and more available capacities of the white factory worker, both persons are equally valuable individuals with the same rights, because intelligence is not the decisive criterion in this respect but just one of many human features. When we do not make a moral differentiation based on intelligence between individuals within one and the same race column, it is a bit stupid to make it between the various racial groups mutually, all the more because the differences in average intelligence between those groups are far less great than between the individuals within each racial group. The third reason why Lombardini doesn't think that his acknowledgement of the existence of unequal average intelligence between racial groups is racist, is because it is backed by science. How can something that is established as a fact on the basis of the universal laws of nature be racist? That can only be if the dogma of systemic racism and white privilege itself is not in line with earthly reality, but nonetheless dominating society rigorously on account of other means, like education, media propaganda, and constant repetition of that opinion in public by institutions, politicians, academics, activists and role models, all propagating equal average intelligence of all racial population groups. But the chance that all human races on average have the exact same cognitive abilities is statistically nil. Knowing that human races have developed largely independently, within a fixed cluster of different groups, thus separated from each other, during the last 50,000 years of history, which has created such great differences in external appearances between them, the chance that all human races on average have the exact same intelligence is statistically negligible, and one must even say zero. Henry Harpending, a Harvard graduate, a distinguished professor at the University of Utah and member of the National Academy of Sciences, specialized in genetic and morphometric variation within and between human populations with mathematical models, examining hypotheses such as population growth, divergence, and gene flow, looked jointly with Gregory M. Cochrane, an American anthropologist, at the statistical probability of equal racial intelligence in view of the relevant criteria for genetic evolution, and concluded, the biological equality of human races is about as likely as a fistful of silver dollars all landing on their edge when dropped. Thus not on the same flat side, but all landing on their edge after the same throw. So, in view of the law of gravity, the chance is zero. When making this statement, Harpending also talked about biological intelligence. When taking notice of the relevant factors for the evolution of human intelligence within the context of evolutionary history, knowing that human races, after they were split off from their common ancestors around 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, have largely developed separately without mutual genetic interchange, the conclusion must be that it is impossible that all human races during that path, although encountering on that route very different aspects explaining all other differences in their natural genetic composition, have developed on average exactly the same intelligence and exactly the same other cognitive capacities. That's indeed what it is, as Lombardini claims, an impossibility. Not a dogmatic impossibility, but a scientific impossibility established on account of the universal laws of nature determining everything on Earth and beyond, including mankind itself. This of course doesn't answer the question which ethnic population is on average more or less intelligent than the other, nor whether these differences are only marginal or significant. But it shows that the fixed premise within Western morality, indicating that on average all human racial groups have by nature the exact same cognitive abilities, is not sustainable. In other words, it's wrong, a fallacy, or, if you please, another ideologically shaped hallucination merely based on subjective moralities that were leading within a specific period of history in a specific part of the world. That in itself says something about the value of that premise. Scientifically speaking, it has no value, for it is founded on all sorts of moral criteria not related to aspects really determining humans' inborn intelligence, thus that are not of importance for that development. So when you use such an unproven assumption as starting point for your ideas, there is a chance that it appears to be false. It was a guess, nothing more. Meanwhile we know it was a wrong guess. Still it has become part of our culturally formed hallucination, where it has affixed itself tightly to our emotions about what is apparently right and wrong. That, however, doesn't mean that it should not be challenged. When we still have to obey the dogmatic starting point that every race on average has the exact same intelligence and mental capacities, implying that the average socio-economic outcomes of all racial groups should be exactly the same too, this means that society is forced to adjust itself to a fantasy tale that is in conflict with reality. As said earlier, this must lead to an infringement on the liberal principles of individual sovereignty and equality and may even turn into a tyranny. We cannot treat people differently on the basis of their race. An individual East Asian student cannot be held accountable for the fact that on average East Asians perform better at school. Then why is it justified to limit the rights and equal position of this individual East Asian person? He has nothing to do with other East Asians, nor benefits from their achievements, but has to compete on the basis of his own possibilities and capacities with all other people. Why should one of those others then be favored because he belongs on account of his race to a group that on average performs worse at universities? This is a principal line that we cannot cross. Meanwhile, white people are being blamed as a group, in fact as a race, for everything that apparently is wrong in society. Every difference in socio-economic outcomes is immediately attributed to racism by whites and white privilege. An entire racial population is being used as scapegoat for what apparently is wrong. Only their skin color makes them racist and profiting from white privilege, while in truth quite other factors determine the differences in socio-economic outcomes between various racial population groups. That is why the dogma cannot provide a solution and will only cause more polarization and racial hatred. Its theoretical foundation does not provide another solution than blaming one specific race, in a similar way as how the Nazis blamed the allegedly evil and wicked Jews who on average performed better in German society than the so-called superior Aryans. The current movement is a dead-end street. It can only cause harm. Lombardini therefore chooses for another option. Accepting racial intelligence differences in a society where IQ is the decisive factor for societal success, justifies additional support and sometimes even affirmative actions on behalf of all people with a low intelligence, regardless of their race. And it certainly justifies additional support for people who on account of their social environment are unable to use their full potentials independently. Lombardini therefore does not propose great changes in the current policies, although favoring one individual over another merely because of his race, that is to say because of the position of the racial group to which he is ranked, should never be allowed. Instead, Lombardini suggests to diminish the importance of intelligence and education for socio-economic outcomes. Increase the wages of all people with a low or medium-skilled job to the detriment of the huge salaries of the highly educated class and the exorbitant capital of the 1% richest people, and you will see that blacks and other minorities will profit proportionally more from this measure than whites, reducing the differences in average outcomes between the various racial groups at the same time. Intelligence, that is to say education, and the possession of capital simply have become too important today. Other skills are just as well necessary to create a well-functioning and fair society, and they should be appreciated and compensated more than we do now. Lombardini thinks that it is no surprise that the current left-wing elites of the highly educated class and those who are dominating Hollywood, the mainstream media and big tech companies, prefer the current policy of blaming the so-called evil whites, over a real cut in their salaries and capital. Policies of blaming whites and favoring minorities does not affect them at all. Cuts in their salary and capital, however, will be felt by them immediately in their private lives. But when you see how much influence IQ has in today's Western societies on virtually all socio-economic outcomes, regardless of the race involved, there is no other option than to tackle the problem at its core. Reduce the reward for intelligence and raise the reward for other human traits and abilities. Otherwise, Western societies will be dominated in future even more than today by a small but very wealthy highly educated upper class, while the middle class and social lower class get poorer by the day. When that happens, not only the so-called deplorable white masses will suffer from that, but also the vast majority of Hispanics, Afro-Americans, and European Muslims. They as well will be the victim in the end. In that sense, the common people of all races have the same goal and interests. They should not let themselves be played off against each other by an elite with clearly other interests, nor by black activists with a Marxist agenda only looking for power regardless of the consequences thereof for others. Those who are interested in more details of Flavio Lombardini's views, can read his entire article on our website. Thank you for watching, and keep thinking independently.